What happens when we have the kinds of disagreements I've illustrated? It's in that context that I think we have to rely on, not on principle, but on a process for making decisions. So what I'm going to suggest is that the core of health policy will focus on a decision-making process. So the claim I want to make is that if we have no prior agreement on principles regarding what is fair and just in the allocation of resources, we have to accept the outcome of a fair process as fair and legitimate. And this is a general characterization of what in the philosophical literature is called pure procedural justice. So what I've suggested is that with regard to the priority to the worst off problem, we don't have agreement on a principle. Many of us think we ought to give some priority to those who are worse off, but not complete priority, and certainly not no priority. But we disagree with each other about how much priority, and that's going to show up in our differences in how we want to allocate resources. If we then think practically about what processes we put in place, what we should notice about this assumption that I made, that the outcome of a fair process will count as fair and legitimate, is that the kind of situation we're in is a little different from what we might think of as pure procedural justice. In the philosophical literature, and here I have in mind John Rawls' discussion of procedural justice, he contrasts impure with pure procedural justice. In impure procedural justice, we have a prior conception of what we count as just. We have a prior agreement on a principle. Let's take criminal trials as an example. Most of us will agree right off the bat that we should convict all and only the guilty in a criminal trial. And we try to set up criminal trials to do that. We give a reasonable, beyond a reasonable doubt as a criterion for evidence in a trial. And that may be whether we're talking about conviction by a judge or conviction by a jury. We think that the evidence has to be overwhelming, that somebody is guilty, because we're very afraid of convicting innocent people. So we want to convict all and only the guilty. We do have room for noticing that evidence would work out in a way that is contrary to the actual trial that we run. So suppose we have a trial and we judge it to be a fair trial. Good arguments were presented on both sides, and the judge has made a decision about who was guilty. But later along comes some evidence, let's say it's DNA evidence, that shows that the person who was convicted, perhaps by eyewitness testimony, turns out not to be guilty, wasn't even there. Biological samples don't prove that this person couldn't have been the culprit. We might then think we ought to overturn the outcomes of a fair trial. The trial was fair, but it got it wrong. And that's what's meant by saying this is impure procedural justice. We have a criterion, convict all and only the guilty. And we try to use a trial to tell us or to guide us towards who we think the best evidence would point to as being guilty, but we might get it wrong. Now, the contrast with pure procedural justice is that we may not have a criterion for what counts as a fair outcome. Take the example I gave a moment ago about giving priority to the worst off. Some of us think we should give a lot of priority. Some of us think we should give some priority. Maybe only a few people think we should give complete priority and a few people think we should give none. Most people are in the middle. But they disagree with each other about how much priority, and they might disagree about resource allocation questions in part because they're disagreeing about that. That's the kind of decision that I think we have in health policy all the time. Cases where there's a lot of disagreement, and we have to find a process for resolving it. But we can't say we know what counts as fair. What counts as fair has got to emerge from the process.